everyone, and welcome to the lineup. Today is June the 9th, 2022. I'm Barry Stagner, and if you're joining us for the first time, what we do here is we look at the news events of the world that relate to Bible prophecy, and of course, we can't cover them all in but a single hour or a little under that, but we'll pick some of the stories that I think have significant relevance to what the Bible has to say about the last days scenario. Our first story comes from the Times of Israel. The headline reads, Israel vows to defend offshore gas rig amid escalating tensions with Lebanon. Israel on Wednesday insisted that its new offshore natural gas rig in the Mediterranean will not pump from a disputed area with Lebanon and urged the resumption of talks to solve the issue as tensions flared between Jerusalem and Beirut. In a joint statement, Defense Minister Benny Gantz, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, and Energy Minister Karine El-Harar also warned that Israel has the right to defend its strategic infrastructure and is prepared to do so. Lebanon and Israel, which have no diplomatic relations and consider each other enemy states, have been holding indirect talks brokered by the U.S. for close to 2 years to resolve a maritime border dispute. This new drilling platform arrived on Sunday at the Karish site, which Israel says is part of its UN-recognized exclusive economic zone and which Beirut insists is in the disputed area. It is expected to become operational in the next few months. The minister's joint statement said the Karish rig is a strategic asset of the State of Israel and is intended to extract the energy resources and natural gas in the State of Israel's economic zone and to advance Israel's green economy. And with its anchoring, the rig is located in Israeli territory, several kilometers south of the area over which negotiations are being conducted between the State of Israel and the Republic of Lebanon, mediated by the United States. We call on the Republic of Lebanon to accelerate negotiations on the maritime border, the ministers wrote, adding that resolving the issue will benefit Lebanon's economy and its citizens. The years-long dispute flared in the past week due to the installment of the Karish facility, and Beirut reacted angrily, and the Lebanese Hezbollah terror group issued threats. The Speaker of Lebanon's parliament, Nabi Berri, told the parliamentary session on Tuesday that the U.S. energy diplomat Amos Hochstein is expected in the country on Sunday or Monday of next week, and Lebanon urged Hochstein to quickly help resolve the spike in tensions over the rig. The envoy mediated previous indirect talks between the sides that have now stalled. Now, Hezbollah Deputy Chief Naim Qassem told Reuters on Monday that it is prepared to use force against Israel if Lebanon determines that its maritime borders have been breached. And when the Lebanese state says that Israelis are assaulting our waters, our oil, then we are ready to do our part in terms of pressure, deterrence, and use of appropriate means, including force, Qassem said. Senior IDF general also threatened Hezbollah military infrastructure on Lebanon's border on Tuesday, and talks surrounding the disputed territory that began in late 2020 have been on hold because of the demands of the Lebanese. Now, here's one reason I wanted us to take a look at this story. One, we do know that there's an economic factor that's involved in the Ezekiel invasion. We also know that right now, pretty much everything that's been going on is just saber rattling, and most of the comments and the rhetoric are I'll do this, and then the other side says I'll do that. But really, what we're seeing here now is interesting because we have two sides saying if we have to militarily engage over energy-related products, then we will do just that. Now, this highlights an issue that we've been talking about in actually the recent or past couple of years, really, and that is that the economic situation in Russia is going to be part of the motivation, most likely, to draw them down from the north. Could very well be the hook in the jaw that God uses to bring them down, a crashing economy. And this is the very motivation for the threats of the Lebanese. Their economy is worse than terrible. It'd have to get better to be terrible. And so here we see now them saying, we want this particular area reserved for us so we can tap those natural resources. Israel says, say it's in our UN apportioned economic zone. We have every right to drill there and to bring the oil to market, the gas, I should say, to market from there. And of course, the whole point of this is that there is a relationship between energy-related products, it seems, definitely economic in nature, that is the cause of the Ezekiel invasion and the declining economies of the invading countries. Turkey's in trouble, Iran's in trouble, Russia's in big trouble financially. Libya's long been in trouble, as Sudan. So you've got these 5 countries that are in economic dire straits, who can't afford to have a competing uh, new group in the market, so to speak, especially accessing Europe. That's not the motivation of the Lebanese or Hezbollah. It's just a typical animosity toward Israel, and anything they do, they're going to stand against. But here we have, the potential for another fuse lighting of the powder keg that's the Middle East, and threats being made of the use of military force to protect one's rights over Mediterranean waters and the natural resources that are underneath them. The Jewish News Syndicate says Israel's burgeoning relationship with Egypt suggests brighter future for both countries. Israel and Egypt have agreed on a new plan to advance ties and now appear to be engaged in the process of migrating from a cold peace to lukewarm. Serious discussions are currently underway between Israel, Egypt, and the European Commission over how to export Eastern Mediterranean gas to Europe. At the same time, Israel and Egypt also are working to improve economic ties, with plans to increase bilateral annual trade to $700 million within 3 years. In addition, efforts are being made to expand the Natanza border crossing, where commercial trade between the two countries is handled. And according to Iran Lerman, the vice president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, Israel is indeed heading towards better relations with Egypt. Now, the reason this story is noteworthy is that, when Israel declared statehood on May 14th on our calendar, 1948, that evening they were invaded by 5 countries, 5 Arab countries, and Israel was at the head of that. And we see Israel involved in the 67 and 73 engagements, as well as other military activities. And yet the Bible says that in the end, that they will all, Assyria, Egypt, and Israel will be the Lord's people. And so watching this type of thing develop, knowing that Israel is not going to play, or Egypt is not going to play a part in the Ezekiel invasion, and yet they very well could contribute to that hook in the jaw element that Ezekiel prophesies, by allowing Israel to use their country as a stop point, so to speak, to access the European market with energy-related products that, again, Turkey doesn't want, Russia doesn't want. And so again, noting that the Bible is in absolute authority, and everything that it says is going to come to pass, even when it's completely bizarre and seemingly unusual. The Lord to call the Egyptians his people after he disciplines them, and the Assyrians, the 2 oldest enemies of Israel, the Egyptians and the Assyrians, to be one with the Israeli people, and one before the Lord, and all sharing the same language is actually what Isaiah says. So interesting to see these overtures being made, and the fact that, as I said, Egypt will not play a part in the Ezekiel invasion, even though they've been at the point in every other battle thus far, every other major battle, I should say. Now, the Jewish News Syndicate is also reporting that Iran is smuggling missile parts via passenger flights after alleged IAF strike on the Damascus airport. Damage to the runways at Damascus International Airport has reportedly prevented Iranian cargo planes from landing there, so Iran has resorted to smuggling precision missile components into Syria via hand luggage on European passenger flights following an alleged Israeli Air Force strike in May that damaged runways at Damascus International Airport, Israeli media reported on Tuesday. The alleged Israeli strike was supported by Syrian-made state media on May 20th, and satellite images released by ImageSat International showed damage to the runways. The strike effectively prevents Iran from landing its large Boeing 747 cargo planes at the airport, Channel 12 in Israel reported on Tuesday. And these are the planes that deliver the precision missile systems, which in the end moved to Hezbollah, the report added. Those planes have not been able to land at the airport since the attack, according to Channel 12. And then the Associated Press is reporting the fatal blow to talks. UN nuke watchdog says Iran removing 27 surveillance cameras. The head of the UN's nuclear watchdog agency said on Thursday that Iran is removing 27 surveillance cameras from nuclear sites in the country, raising the risk of its inspectors being unable to track Tehran's advances as it enriches uranium closer than ever to weapons-grade levels. Rafael Mariano Grossi, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, made the comments at a hastily called news conference in Vienna, standing next to an example of the cameras installed across Iran. Grossi said the move poses a, quote, serious challenge, end quote, to its efforts, warning that in 3 to 4 weeks it would be unable to maintain a continuity of knowledge about Iran's program. This would be a fatal blow to negotiations over Iran's tattered nuclear deal with world powers, Grossi said. When we lose this, then it's anybody's guess, he added. Iran did not immediately acknowledge it was removing the cameras, though it threatened Wednesday to take more steps amid a years-long crisis that threatens to widen into further attacks across the Mid-East. And Grossi said that would leave 40-something cameras still in Iran. The sites that would see cameras removed, including the underground Natanz nuclear enrichment facility, as well as the Isfahan facility, Grossi went on to say. We're in a very tense situation with the negotiations over the nuclear deal at a low ebb. And now we're adding this to the picture. And as you can see, it's not a very nice one. You know, we've talked constantly about the fact that the level of incompetency, the high level of incompetency in high places is something the Bible has also foretold. And, you know, it's just amazing to me that people don't do their homework, and people who both report these things and also interact with these things. And the IAEA is absolutely blind to the fact that Muslims are allowed to lie to advance their cause. And they have no problem whatsoever shaking their head like this when the reality is going to be that they're not going to stop enriching uranium. They are going to continue. And yeah, they'll tell the IAEA and the world community these are for energy use only. And yet, energy use levels of enriched uranium is 20%. They're already at 60. So what's the point? And they keep sitting down. These people, these incompetent people, keep sitting down at the table to negotiate with a group that, and they try and blame it on Trump. You know, they continue to enrich uranium, you know, because of Donald Trump pulling out of the deal and all these other things. They were going to continue to enrich it anyway. And even under the deal, they could still reach the level of enrichment where they could produce a weapon in 10 years. It was just a ridiculous proposition in the first place. But here again, we have people in high places of power that are absolutely clueless to reality and the peoples that they're dealing with. And what do we see them in response to a bombed runway that is long enough to support the landing of a 747? Well, they just put stuff in suitcases and ship the parts via passenger planes through other airlines, just general commercial airlines. Now, if their intentions were good, why are they continuing with their threats and arming Hezbollah and allowing them and the some 150,000 missiles that are in Lebanon pointed at Israel to be equipped with these guidance systems that are developed in Iran? And again, you know, when they say they seek the destruction of Israel, now that's something they ought to believe. And yet the global community doesn't seem to buy that. Now, here's an interesting story. Now, this is an opinion piece, and you'll tell that through the title right away, or the headline right away. And the headline from the Times of Israel says, Netanyahu and the right are about to regain power, and they'll hold it for a long time. The final blow to the coalition could come from many directions, but it will. And Israel won't get a government of the ideological hue most of the electorate voted for a year ago. The eight-party coalition that took office in Israel a year ago was always misrepresentative of the electorate's ideological affiliations. More than 70 of the 120 politicians Israelis voted into the Knesset in March of 2021 came from seven firmly right-wing parties, either secular or religious: Likud, Shas, Yamina, United Torah Judaism, Yisrael Betenu, and religious Zionism and New Hope. And Israel has been governed these past 12 months by a coalition that spans the political spectrum from right to left, with an Islamist party in for good measure, only because the leaders of three of those seven right-wing parties, Yamina, Yisrael Betenu, and New Hope, opted to put aside core principles for what they argued was a greater Israeli interest, which was ousting Benjamin Netanyahu. And it was last June that Netanyahu found himself consigned to the opposition after a record 12-year stint as prime minister, and several of his former allies, led by Naftali Bennett, joined forces with his longtime political opponents to run the country. And today, though, that coalition is on its last legs. First, it lost its narrow majority. Now it can't even reliably manage a 60-60 parity in the parliament. On Monday night, it came nowhere near mustering the votes to pass routine legislation to renew the application of Israeli law to settlers, and the legislation the right-wing opposition voted down despite fully supporting it, so that Netanyahu can show Israelis that their government simply no longer has the votes to govern. Now, this would be an interesting development. And again, that's an opinion piece. And I have to say, I don't mind the opinion, and I think it would be a good thing for Israel to have a strong leader in the country, one that stands for them and isn't worried about this whole egalitarian thing that everybody seems to be so consumed with in these last days, and one who has the national interest of their country in mind and is willing to stand up to the international community and not bow down to the pressures of the UN or anybody else. And, it's Netanyahu who has said, now Bennett said the same thing, but Netanyahu has made no bones about the fact that they will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And, the strike we see in Damascus was, an indirect strike on Iran. But, I think Netanyahu and his particular approach to things would be better for the country. And it's just interesting to see the parallels between the greatest superpower the world has ever known, and that is the United States of America, and Israel, a miracle birth back in May of 1948, prophesied by God in Ezekiel and Jeremiah. And, just to see similar things going on at the highest level of politics in both countries, to where a strong voice was ousted because of, basically personality. And, I think we all need to remember, especially with midterms coming up here in the United States, we're not voting for personalities. We're voting for platforms. We're voting for what people stand for, not necessarily even how they express what they stand for. And, this current administration has made it quite clear where they stand on issues that should matter most to us. And got a couple of interesting stories we're going to wrap up with today. But our next story comes from the Times of Israel once again, and the headline reads, "The UN probe blames Israel for perpetuating conflict with the Palestinians." Members of Open-Ended Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry says ending occupation will break the cycle of violence, and Israel calls the report a waste of money. A report released Tuesday by a United Nations Commission of Inquiry blamed Israel's persistent discrimination against Palestinians for the violence between the two sides. Forced displacement, threats of forced displacement, demolitions, settlement construction and expansion, settler violence, and blockade of Gaza were identified as the contributing factors to recurring cycles of violence by the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. The 18-page report, released Tuesday, focuses on root causes of the conflict, and the commission took 2 trips to research the report, one to Geneva and the other to Jordan. Why didn't they go to Israel? Israel has refused to cooperate with the commission and has not granted it entry into Israel, there's why, and or access to Palestinian-controlled areas in the West Bank and Gaza. The report reaffirmed that the UN sees Israeli settlements as illegal, including in East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. It also blasted Israel for restrictions on Palestinian movement and for settler violence. Israel destroys Palestinian water infrastructure, alleged the commission, and tries to silence critical voices in Palestinian civil society. Harassment and abuse of Palestinian women and girls by Israeli security forces in the occupied Palestinian territory has been reported at checkpoints and on the way to and from school and work, charged the report. Ending Israel's occupation in full conformity with the Security Council's resolution remains essential in stopping the persistent cycle of violence, according to Commissioner Milun Kothari. Now, again, I wish some people in some of these places who are the spokesman for entities like the UN would read a book and come to the understanding that, first of all, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. They're just Arabs. They're Arabs from Syria. And, Israel has put them in refugee camps, or they're still in refugee camps since May of 48, because they abandoned their homes because Egypt and 4 other countries said, get out of your houses. We're going to wipe this new nation out on its first day of existence. And so they abandoned their homes. And well, if somebody moved out of their house so an army could come in and destroy you and your family, would you let them move back in next door afterwards? Well, I don't think so. And again, just all of this nonsense that comes out of the UN, like how they call it in Israel, the United Nothing. And really, their voice is just one, again, of absolute and complete ignorance. Israel has been in that land, the Jews have been in that land for 3,500 years. And there is no Palestine. That was renamed, that particular area was renamed after the Bar Kokhba revolution in 136 AD by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who hated the Jews. And he therefore renamed the land after the ancient enemies of Israel, Palestina, which is the Latinized form of Philistine. Philistines were from the island of Crete. They were known as in history, the Aegean Sea people. They're not even Arabs. The Philistines, that is. And yet we know very clearly that even Muslim scholars have called the quote-unquote Palestinians Syrian Arabs in some of their documents. So again, we have this, Israel's the perpetrator, Israel's to blame. And listen, I've had this accusation made, and I'll just address it before anybody says it. Listen, we don't just support Israel no matter what they do, but we do support their right to exist. And we do recognize historically that they have every right to that land. God gave them that land. And you know what? It doesn't even matter, because like the Palestinians and Yasser Arafat, they're trying to predate Israel as to an existence in the land, saying that they are the descendants of the Canaanites. Well, if God gives you a land, that's your land. And if he gives it to you by everlasting covenant forever, that's your land. Doesn't matter who was there first. God gave them that land, and that is their land, and they have been there in some form or fashion for 3,500 years, had some type of presence there. Well, if not Netanyahu gains power again, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Of course, we've got talk about this election coming up, in the U.S. presidential election coming up in a little over 2 years, and Trump and all this other stuff that's being talked about out there. But I think it would be interesting to see Netanyahu, a strong leader in Israel during this particular time where threats are coming over energy-related products, as we talked about in our first story, and Netanyahu to take the helm again and to take the positions that he has in time past and stand strong for Israel, take a nationalist perspective, much like we heard from 45, the U.S. first, America first kind of thing. Well, Israel first has been basically the unsaid mantra of Netanyahu and his administrations. And, there's nothing wrong with loving your country and wanting to see it experience the best that it can as far as its economy and opportunity and all these other things. And yet the UN continues to blame Israel for all the unrest in the Middle East. I hope you noticed that in this, all of these charges against Israel, that the UN did not mention rockets fired from Gaza, incendiary balloons sent from Gaza, the destruction of tens of thousands of acres of farmland and forest in Israel caused by the Palestinians, which is what causes the Israelis to respond. And again, just the ignorance of these people of actual facts and the manipulation of truth, basically, in order to bring about their desired end, which is the end of Israel. Well, it's not going to happen. Amos said in 9, I believe it's 11, that when Israel is back in the land, they will not be uprooted again. And if the Bible said it, that's the end of that. Now, our next story comes from Watchers, again, a weather website that we look to from time to time. They've reported in the past on some of these coronal mass ejections or solar flares that we've talked about a bit of late. And the headline reads, the U.S. declares national energy emergency. The United States declared a national energy emergency on June 6, 2022. The emergency, declared to exist with respect to the threats of the availability of sufficient electricity generation capacity to meet expected customer demand, will stay in effect for at least 24 months or until it's declared terminated, whichever occurs first. A robust and reliable electric power system is not only a basic human necessity, but it is also critical to national security and national defense, the president said in the declaration. Multiple factors are threatening the ability of the United States to provide sufficient electricity to the generation to serve expected customer demand. The declaration goes on to say these factors include disruptions to energy markets caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change. For example, in parts of the country, drought conditions coupled with heat waves are simultaneously causing projected electricity supply shortfalls and record electricity demand. And as a result, the Federal Reserve, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation have both warned of near-term electricity reliability concerns in their recent summer reliability assessments. And again, I mentioned this last week, and California seems to lead the charge as far as the in the governmental level for making just ridiculous and idiotic decisions. And here off the coast of Southern California in Carlsbad, they proposed a plan to build a desalination plant and basically, fill our reservoirs with water pumped from the ocean and pump the salt water back into the sea. And, but the environmental group said, no, the environmental cost is too high, the potential damage. And yet here you've got other countries around the world that, have short water supply that are taking the salt out of the ocean water, which covers 2/3 of the surface of the earth. And, making sure that their crops are watered and all that. And then last week we talked about the story where, the rice supply, California being a major supplier of rice here in the States, is going to be damaged this year simply because they won't release enough water to water the rice paddies here in Central California. So again, just incredible things we see going on in high levels of government. And, some of the ridiculous things that are being said and done that basically shoot ourselves in the foot. This president, first thing he did was basically cancel the Keystone Pipeline plan, which would keep us energy independent or at least help us to be that. And, again, it's just incredible to see some of the delusional thinking of these last days. Now, here's another story of interest that comes from Breitbart. Mexican president calls for American superstate and open border, is reviving calls for a continental superstate that would combine North American employers and South American employees and sideline tens of millions of middle-class Americans. I will go in July to visit President Joe Biden at the White House, and I want to discuss with him the issue of the integration of all America, President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador said at a press conference in Mexico's presidential palace. He continued, my position is that just as how the European community was created, we have to do that in America. However, any unification could only come after the United States and Southern countries resolve their disagreements, he said. There has to be a change in policy, an end to the confrontation, an end to hate, an end to threats, the blockades, the foreign interference, the choose brotherhood, good neighbor policies. The same continent-wide superstate was pushed in 2001 by President G.W. Bush and Mexico's then President Vicente Fox. Their unpopular Any Willing Worker plan would have allowed U.S. employers to easily import low-wage employees from Central and South America. It was derailed following the 9/11 attack of 2001. The policy would spike Wall Street and Fortune 500 profits by giving them floods of cheap foreign workers, plus many new foreign consumers. And Lopez Obrador's statement came during a long complaint about U.S. politics and the supposed power of the anti-Latino Cuban voters in the United States. I have a very good relationship with President Biden, he said. He's a good man. In this case, I feel that there are a lot of pressures on the part of the Republicans, and above all from some leaders of the Republican Party and also in the Democrat Party, that has to do with the Cuban community in Florida and in the United States. He said, if we stay divided like this, depending on the decision of one gentleman, the influence of one gentleman, of the rankers of one gentleman, and we forget our peoples, well, then we are acting in a sectarian way, trafficking the pain of the peoples, taking advantage of, thriving, taking advantage of politically and economically. And again, of course, the smacks of the one world system that we do know is coming. But just this mentality that, there's a certain group that if you say, we need to protect our borders and we need to monitor those who are coming in to our country, well, then, basically you're the problem. And because, as he says, he feels that just this open borders situation, and he says, of course, the most inhuman, anti-immigrant, authoritarian politicians are the Republicans. And there's a few in the Democratic Party, too, he went on to say. So, again, this finger pointing and because somebody wants to take a nationalist position. And really, that's what got the previous president in so much trouble, is that whole America First thing that we talked about a few moments ago. And now here you've got Obrador, the president of Mexico, saying, you know what, one continent, one country, just like the Europeans did. And the interesting thing about that is he doesn't seem to recognize all the problems the EU has had. And remember Brexit and Britain rather wanting to pull out from that, and because they got tired of bailing out other countries. And we do know that happened with Greece multiple times. And, again, that's really what he's looking for. He's looking to tap the U.S. financial base to feed the people in his country and feed them jobs and feed them literally. He talking about Biden being a good man because he wants to open the borders up himself. And again, just watching this move towards globalism, this shift in thinking, this egalitarian thinking, and we see this coming from multiple directions, and we'll talk about another that's happening right now in a moment. Now, Breitbart says Chile's far-left president calls for global gun control in a meeting with Trudeau. Chile's far-left president, Gabriel Boric, said on Monday that he hoped to imitate a policy implemented by leftist Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that would significantly limit gun ownership in the country. Boric made the remarks while visiting Canada. Both leaders are expected to attend this week's Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, California. We've discussed details about the firearms restriction policy that has been promoted in Canada for quite some time, which has had very good results, and which in Chile we also want to precisely imitate as well, because good ideas are great to replicate in our countries, Boric said in a joint statement with Trudeau at the end of the diplomatic encounter. In the same statement, Boric called for international firearm control legislation. We have to promote international legislation. Hopefully an awareness will be generated beyond our borders that the possession of firearms is bad for society. That kind of talk comes from people who want to rule society. And there's plenty of evidence historically to support that. That's one of the first things that oppressive governments try and do, or socialist governments or communist governments do, is they disarm the populace. This is why we do it from Chile to Canada. Hopefully, with all the countries that are close, hopefully it will be of some use. And the meeting between Boric and Trudeau took place a week after Trudeau announced a complete freeze on handgun sales in Canada. Boric's gun control statements in Canada are a continuation of his government's ongoing push towards firearm control in Chile. And again, there's lots of problems in Chile, lots of violence in Chile. And, Chilean laws currently allows for rather, any resident over the age of 18 to legally own up to 2 firearms, provided they go through an extensive procedure, which includes registering with the National Firearm Authority, obtaining psychiatric approval, and passing an official exam on the proper use and maintenance of firearms. Obtaining a permit for said firearms is a completely separate process, and certain firearm types, such as semi-automatic weapons, are outright forbidden by law in Chile. But Boric says a Chile without firearms is a safer Chile. Well, one of the interesting things about this is much of the violence has been against the government and protest against the government. And he said, armed violence will not be tolerated in our country. And this is why our Fewer Guns, More Security program proposes a radical limitation of legal access. Well, we live here in California, one of the most restrictive gun control or gun law states in the country. And I think that the Chilean law now even exceeds the restrictions in California. And, we hear a lot of talk about this. And let me just say this, on the heels of what happened in Texas and all that, of course, it's catastrophic. Of course, it's tragic. And I ran across something that was interesting about this young man who committed this horrific crime and shot all these innocent people, these children and teachers. His nickname in elementary school was School Shooter. Everybody picked on him because they saw he had some mental problems, some emotional problems. And, in Chile, there's a psychiatric evaluation with owning a gun. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't work around a system or take their parents' weapons or any of those other things. But again, this young man needed help, and none was given. And obviously, he lived up to his elementary age nickname, so to speak. Now, Washington Post reports that a man with a gun is arrested near Brett Kavanaugh's home, officials say. A man with a gun and knife was detained by police early Wednesday when near the Maryland home of Brett M. Kavanaugh after making threats against the Supreme Court justice, according to local and federal officials. Nicholas John Rosk, 26, of Simi Valley, California, was charged with attempted murder of a Supreme Court justice after he called authorities and said he was having suicidal thoughts and wanted to kill a specific justice, according to federal prosecutors. Rosk was upset by the leaked draft of an opinion by the Supreme Court signaling that it was positioned to overturn Roe v. Wade, the 49-year-old decision that guarantees a person's constitutional right to abortion, and as well as the recent school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, according to an affidavit filed Wednesday in court. Ross said that he began thinking about how to give his life a purpose and decided he'd kill a Supreme Court justice, the affidavit said, adding that he allegedly planned to break into Kavanaugh's home and kill him and then take his own life. Now, interesting, he wore black clothing, carried a suitcase, a backpack with weapons and other supplies, had a Glock 17, 2 magazines and ammunition, a tactical knife, pepper spray, a hammer, a screwdriver, crowbar, zip ties, duct tape, along with other gear, according to court documents. Now, interesting that those who have been protesting outside of the homes of Supreme Court justices have vowed to continue to do so. And so now here we've got people desiring to take the matter into their own hands. And I'm going to reserve comments for one of our later stories. And our next one is going to feed into it as well. But it's just, things are changing. And, we've talked in the past about the fact that, if there's a major economic crisis here in the United States, a collapse like that of 1929, where the stock market crashes and there's a huge percentage of the population who are unemployed, it's going to be a far different situation than we saw in the 1930s, when you see people standing in bread lines, waiting for their meal for the day, living in tent cities and obviously hoping that things were going to change. But the people acted, for the most part, the vast majority of people, for the most part, took care of one another, watched out for one another, and shared their bread and all that. And we don't have that kind of society anymore. It's a self-oriented society, as the Bible predicted in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Sorry, I had a little pause there for a moment. Breitbart. Schumer says to Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, you will pay the price. Now, we just had somebody try and kill Kavanaugh. Now, Schumer, a government official, says to Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, you will pay the price. You won't know what hits you if you make awful decisions. And during a speech about the abortion case before the Supreme Court on Wednesday, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from New York, stated to Supreme Court Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, you have released a whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hits you if you go forward with these awful decisions. Schumer said, now we stand here today because behind me, inside the walls of this court, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments, as you know, for the first major abortion rights cases since Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch came to the bench. We know what's at stake. Over the last 3 years, women's reproductive rights have come under attack in a way we haven't seen in modern history. From Louisiana to Missouri to Texas, Republican legislatures are waging a war on women, all women, and they're taking away fundamental rights. I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released a whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hits you if you go forward with these awful decisions. Well, Schumer, you just spoke about your own destiny, lest you repent. And you will give an account for things like this when you stand before the Lord someday if you don't come to Christ and repent of this type of thing. And, it just, again, this is one of those things. It's just hard to believe that this is, here's someone, the Democratic minority leader who is threatening two Supreme Court justices. And you know what? They make dumb decisions sometimes. There's no question about that. They're human beings. We know that. But to make threats over a woman's reproductive rights, well, first of all, no woman has the right to take the life of another human being. And that's another human being that is inside of every pregnant woman. I think they would better spend their resources instead of, propping up the pro-choice movement and doing some investigating inside the womb and see how early there's a heartbeat, see how early there's fingers and toes and toenails and fingernails and eyelashes and emotional responses. And, I've seen a animated version of an abortion. And when people watch it, they change their mind immediately, the vast majority of the time. Why? Because abortion is going inside and a mother's womb and chopping a baby up. That's what it is. And there's just no other way to describe it. It's just horrific. It's heinous. It's demonic. And no one should be promoting it or fighting for it. Everyone should be standing against it. And yet here you've got, again, Chuck Schumer threatening two Supreme Court justices because they lean to the right, so to speak, on the issue of abortion. There's sometimes these stories that come our way that I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and it was about something that happened, and I just said, it just always, my mind fairly quickly goes to the long suffering of God. And just how he is so patient and kind and unwilling that any should perish. And to say, make comments about the constitutional right to abortion. There's no constitutional right to kill somebody. That's not guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. It's forbidden by the laws of our land. And all of a sudden, in the age of advanced science, we can no longer see that it's a human child left inside of a mother, yet every pregnant woman gives birth to a human baby if they bring it to full term. And again, it's just amazing that God is so patient. And I'm glad he's that way with me, and I'm sure you are with you as well. But boy, some of these things are just hard to swallow. And, one thing I think that's important for us to remember, and we can see it in Israel's history, is that God he puts up with a lot. And he's very, very patient, as I said. But there comes a time within a nation or within the world, in this case, where the only way to stop the moral downslide is judgment. And that's really a portion of what the tribulation is all about. The 70th week of Daniel finalizes God's discipline on the nation of Israel, bringing them to the point where a third of them will look upon the one whom they pierced and mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, as Zechariah 12:10 says. But we also know from Zechariah 14 that 2/3 of the Jews are going to die during the tribulation. And many, many other people are going to as well. And yet there is going to be this collective rejection of God, preferring that the mountains, calling out even to the mountains and the rocks to hide them from the wrath of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. And it's just amazing to see these things. It's sickening, it's saddening, and should just, again, pull our minds back to how gracious and loving and kind God is. And we need to be praying for men like Chuck Schumer and others who talk as though some great injustice is being done by wanting to protect a baby inside what ought to be the safest place on the whole surface of the planet, that is inside a mother's womb. Now, Watchers is reporting that June temperatures in Queensland dropping to lowest in more than a century. And the Australian Bureau of Meteorology has warned residents living in southeast Queensland of frosty mornings and single-digit temperatures throughout the month, as well as below June average temperatures descend over much of southeast Australia. Some parts of the state are experiencing their lowest June temperatures in more than 100 years. It's usually the last week of June that we get temperatures as cold as this, so it's unusual to have it at the start of June, meteorologist Helen Reed told the NCA Newswire. We're still looking at temperatures well below the June average. The coldest part of the state on June 7th were down on the flat country in Darling Downs, with some areas hitting 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, which is 33 to 35 Fahrenheit. The cold spell is expected to last at least a week, with another cold wave expected to sweep in the southern states next week. Now, if you remember, this whole climate deal got started under the banner of global warming, and then they realized, well, that's not warming, so let's just call it climate change, because some areas are freezing, some areas are warming, just like it always has. Watchers also reports, and I want to read 4 headlines to you, or 3 actually, real quick. Watchers reports heavy rains and floods affect over 800,000 people in China's Jiangxi. Watchers reports extremely heavy rains, floods, and landslides hit Pernambuco, leaving more than 106 people dead in Brazil. Watchers says record-breaking rains hit South Florida, causing widespread flooding in the U.S. And now here we are. California has just on June 1 entered its most restrictive water basic restrictions, I guess, in its history, because we're under a severe drought. And, you know, I've seen pictures of Lake Powell and other places close by, a portion of which makes its way into California for drinking water and watering our crops. And, you know, when the water gets down to the level where boats that have sunk out on the lake are being exposed, you know, it's pretty significant. But, you know, here you've got in the same country areas like South Florida with widespread flooding. And you know what? It's going to rain here again in California. There is coming a time where it's not going to rain for 3 years, and that's during the tribulation, 3.5 years during the tribulation. And but here, you know, I've said this before, kind of tongue in cheek, that I believe in climate change, but I call it what it used to be called, and that is weather. And some years here in California, and come on, California is a desert, at least Southern California. And yes, we've had a low snowpack and all those other things. But you know what? God has promised in Genesis chapter 8, 22, that seed time and harvest, everything is going to continue as it has since the beginning. And, you know, that doesn't mean that we just simply throw our trash into the ocean and dirty our rivers and all of that. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is what our next couple of stories, or a couple of stories down from now, is saying, you know, we need to look at this through a factual basis and you know, look back and, hey, we've had ice ages before. And you know what caused the ice age to end? Climate change. The climate changed. And it wasn't man-made. It was just nature and how God has set things in order. Now, the New York Times says that Salt Lake City could be plagued by poisonous arsenic-laced dust clouds if the Great Salt Lake keeps shrinking. Utah's Great Salt Lake is drying up, and there are no easy solutions, and the cost of doing nothing are very steep. We have this potential environmental nuclear bomb that's going to go off if we don't take some pretty dramatic action, Joel Ferry, a Republican state lawmaker and lakeside rancher, told the New York Times. The lake has already shrunk by more than two-thirds since the late 1980s, the Times reports, and the shrinking lake, with its increasing salinity, could start killing off brine shrimp and flies that feed 10 million migratory birds as early as this summer. If the Great Salt Lake, which has already shrunk by two-thirds, continues to dry up, here's what's in store. The lake, the flies and brine shrimp would die off. Scientists warn it could begin as close to this summer. Utah's ski resorts and mining industry would be at risk. But most alarming, the air surrounding Salt Lake City would occasionally turn poisonous. The lake bed contains high levels of arsenic, and as more of it becomes exposed, the windstorms carry that arsenic into the lungs of nearby residents who make up three-quarters of Utah's population. Utah lawmakers and advocates worried about the shrinking lake point to California's former Owens Lake, which Los Angeles drained for its municipal water supply, and now, after losing a lawsuit, has spent $2.5 billion to keep it from blowing away in deadly dust clouds. To avoid a similar fate, residents of Utah's Green Wasatch Front, the valley from Provo to Brigham City, with Salt Lake City in the middle, could divert less of a snowpack runoff it relies on for residential, business, and agricultural use. The rivers fed by nearby mountains used to replenish the lake before the area's explosive population growth and climate change took their toll. Or Salt Lake City could raise water prices and take other steps to conserve water. That's what's happening here in the U.S. They're restricting water flow to the farmlands, and if you use over so many cubic feet of water here as a homeowner, you'll pay an exorbitant price. And that's what they're doing in California. But again, interesting to think about this and to know that it's not going to rain during the tribulation and things like this happening, and the precursors to it, arsenic-laced dust clouds. I'd never heard of that personally, and therefore I thought this was worthy of mention, that, this is what the world is going to be like during the tribulation period, just all kinds of things that are plaguing humanity. And now here's what I pointed to a moment ago, and this comes from a website called Vox, and it's kind of an effort to bring some balance to the media. And the story reads, "Stop telling kids that climate change will destroy their world. Some climate anxiety is the product of telling kids falsely they have no future." The article says, "My 5-year-old daughter is now old enough to read a lot of books and magazines aimed at children, and it's given me a whole new perspective on the discourse wars over how we talk about climate change, conservation, and the future of the planet." And the author says, "I've written before, climate change is going to be bad, and it will hold back humanity from thriving as much as we should this century. It will likely cause mass migration and displacement and extinction of many species," which it won't. "What it won't do, however, is make the earth unlivable, or even mean that our children live in a poorer world than the one we grew up in. As many climate scientists have been telling us, the world is a better place to live in, especially for people in lower income countries, than it has ever been before, and climate change isn't going to make it as bad as it was even in 1950. I unequivocally reject scientifically and personally the notion that children are somehow doomed to an unhappy life," Kate Marvel, a climate scientist at Columbia, told Ezra Klein in his column this week about overcoming climate despair. "Writing aimed at adults doesn't always do the best job of striking a balance. Though not everyone agrees on precisely what the balance is, books like The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming come to my mind. They do a reasonable job at describing some extreme scenarios that really are worth contemplating, but they still don't add up to an uninhabitable Earth, or even one that'd be an awful place to live." And unfortunately, the message from people like Greta Thunberg and her call to save the planet, and the books that are targeting, 3 to 8-year-olds, say and are telling our young children who are just learning how to read, "There might not be a world to live in when she grows up. What use is school without a future?" Thunberg said, even as a setup for Thunberg's rise as an activist. "I'm not thrilled about that message," the author said. "Some might hear that and be inspired to speak before the UN, but most kids are going to hear that and be scared and disempowered. And this pessimistic message seems to be sinking in for the young." And again, I think it's worth remembering that the Lord said causing children to stumble is something that he takes a very dim view of. And for those who cause children to stumble, it'd be better for a millstone to be hung around their neck and they be cast into the sea. And, just looking at the hopelessness of children today and just this message, you came from nowhere, you're going nowhere, life has no meaning, and when you die, that's it. That's the evolutionary end game. And now, telling them while they're alive, you're not going to have a future anyway. So why study hard? Why work hard? What's the point of school if there's going to be no earth for you to live in because of climate change? And I agree with this author. Stop selling this message to our children. Now, here's a story. And again, this points back to what I said earlier about the Lord just being just so incredibly patient and kind. And as he said in Luke, the Lord is kind to the unthankful and the evil. And indeed he is. And this story, just stunning that someone would have the audacity to say something like this on a national media level, reaching not just our country, but others around the world repeating it. This comes from MSNBC. And the headline says, gun control ghouls say we desperately need to display images of dead children. We need to display images of dead children, according to MSNBC. Pro-abortion liberals rage against laws requiring ultrasounds before women can get an abortion. But whereas liberals oppose having people see living babies, many liberals are now clamoring to force people to view dead babies and children, the victims of mass shootings, after approvingly citing an article in The Atlantic proposing that students refuse to return to school in the fall until Congress passes more gun control laws. Heilemann switched his focus to the dramatic proposal that he's been hearing from a lot of people lately. That is, we need the American people to see what these children's bodies look like when they've been hit, and when they've been hit by these bullets, and make them face the ugliness of it. It'll be a shocking moment, but the only kind of thing that might shock the system enough to get action. There are different kinds of proposals, those two, but they're both really designed to shock the system in some way. Talk about why you think maybe that those types of fresh tactics we're desperately in need of. And Hellerman's guest, Dave Cullen, a gun control advocate and author, heartily agreed. I think we desperately need some new, fresh tactics and creative thinking, and I like this. So should we look for gun control extremists to call on MSNBC, CNN, and other liberal outlets to implement their ghoulish proposal, beginning to display the bodies of children killed in mass shootings? And again, the abortion question. These are the same people, as the article began, stating that they fight against ultrasound machines being placed in abortion clinics so the mothers can see what's actually inside of them, their developed child at whatever state, and especially those in the second and third trimester. It's a baby inside their womb, and yet they don't want anybody to see that because that's going to influence their decision, because people within their hearts know absolutely and understand that killing an innocent child is a heinous crime, unless, of course, it's inside the womb. But this same group doesn't want to see that. And CNN and MSNBC promoting their liberal agenda, it's sickening. It really is. And yet here we are at the end of all things. And 1 Peter 4 says, therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers. And above all else, have a fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. And boy, do we live in an age and a society where sin is rampant in ways that we've never seen before. Things being protected that should be condemned, and things that are long understood as right now being called wrong. Things that were once normal and natural, and now the reversal is true. And, I saw a little ad the other day by a company that promotes LGBTQ and whatever other letters go on the end, T-shirts and hats and that sort of thing. And this particular T-shirt they had designed was in support of the trans community. And it said, something about I think it just simply said, there's not just two genders. And then on the side where you order your T-shirt, it had 2 boxes, male, female. There's not just 2 genders. So order your shirt in either male or female. Again, just the lunacy that we live under today. And I'm just glad to know the Lord. I'm glad to know that there is an end to all this and that Jesus is going to come and get us. And in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, for all who believe and have been born again, we're going to be translated into the presence of the Lord with the dead in Christ and forever be with the Lord. Now, we had a meeting this past week, our pastor's meeting, and we were just talking about what's happening with our children, and our children being indoctrinated and all of that, and we had a pretty lengthy discussion about educating parents and all of that. But sadly, a lot of times it's the parents that's the problem. And the parents are promoting this with their children. And, there's pictures we see or videos we see on the internet of people holding up their babies saying, my baby's gay. They can't even talk. How do you know your baby's gay? These are people raising kids today. And, basically now we've got the participation trophy generation is now parents. And all the things that they experienced and learned growing up is now being indoctrinated right in the home. From their very parents. And so basically what I was telling the staff is, we need to equip parents as best we can, but we also need to tell the kids the truth. And, it's just an amazing thing to see what's happening with especially our children today, and most of all, the youngest among them, and that is those still inside the womb. And they are human beings, make no mistake about it. They are at conception, life begins. And, the heartbeat, I think, starts at like 16 days, something, way, way upstream from where they're calling things, a blob of tissue and non-human and all these things. And, to say that, baby's not a baby until it takes its first breath outside the womb, that's just evil. And yet here we are. We live in the perilous times the Bible had prophesied. So let's keep telling people about Jesus. That's the one thing that is a constant in all societies and cultures, no matter how evil they are. God is still saving souls. We opened last week with a story of an Iranian woman who came to faith, came out of Islam because the Lord visited her in a vision or a dream, and she came to faith in Christ, and that faith continues to today. So God is still saving, and so we need to continue preaching. And even in a time when they will not endure sound doctrine, preaching the word is still the cure for the maladies of society. Well, that's it for this week. And, as tough as some of these stories are, and especially that last one, calling for the display. Can you imagine what that would do to parents to see on television or to see on a poster or, whatever means they want to blast this out there? They interestingly, they refuse to show, the end result of an aborted baby. They refuse to show those kind of things, but they want to show some poor, broken-hearted family's child, dead body to the American citizenry. And, just to have that in your mind, there's something wrong. And, but I'm glad that God is in the business of transforming minds. Amen. Well, that's it for this week, as I said. So hopefully, we'll see what happens this coming week. Maybe something positive will happen in Israel. And maybe as we, turn this corner and hit these midterms, maybe things can turn around in our country. But I think most of all, we need to remember that the hope for America, the hope for Israel, the hope for the world is Jesus. And, thankfully, he takes messed up, confused thinking and gives people the mind of Christ. So we'll see you maybe next week. But what I do know for sure is we will see you here, there, or in the air. God bless you.